The man sitting across from Oprah Winfrey carried his camera like a sacred instrument, his hands trembling slightly, not from nerves, but from the medication that was keeping the tumor in his brain from stealing his final months more quickly than it already planned to. At 35, James Park possessed both a terminal diagnosis and an extraordinary mission. He had spent the past 6 months photographing dying people in their final moments, capturing what he believed was the exact instant when the human soul became visible in their eyes. His weathered leather camera bag sat beside his chair, containing not just professional equipment, but also 200 photographs that he claimed revealed the beauty of death, the moment of transition from life to whatever came after. His appearance told the story of someone fighting a battle against time itself. James had lost significant weight during his cancer treatment, making his dark eyes appear larger and more intense behind wire-rimmed glasses. His once thick black hair had grown back in patches after chemotherapy, creating an asymmetrical pattern that he wore with the dignity of someone who had stopped caring about conventional appearances. He wore a simple black sweater and jeans, professional clothing that wouldn't distract from the gravity of his work. But the slight yellowing of his skin and the careful way he moved spoke of someone whose body was gradually betraying him. The terminal brain tumor had been discovered 8 months earlier, following a series of headaches that James had initially attributed to the stress of running his photography studio. The oncologist had been direct: glioblastoma multiforme, grade 4, inoperable due to its location, with a median survival time of 12 to 15 months, even with aggressive treatment. James had 18 months, possibly 24 if he was exceptionally fortunate with experimental therapies, but more likely 12 months to complete whatever he considered his life's most important work. The familiar warmth of Harpo Studios buzzed around them, but James experienced it through the lens of someone whose relationship with mortality had been fundamentally altered. Every moment carried additional weight because he knew, with medical certainty, that he had a finite and rapidly diminishing number of moments remaining. The bright lights of the television studio reminded him of the hospital lighting where he had received his diagnosis, but also of the gentle illumination he used when photographing his subjects during their most vulnerable and sacred transitions. Oprah Winfrey sat in her signature chair, radiant in a deep golden silk blouse. But James noticed, with the heightened awareness that terminal illness brings, the subtle signs of her own mortality, the barely visible lines around her eyes, the careful way she positioned herself to minimize any physical discomfort, the humanity that connected her to every other person facing the universal reality of death. His condition had given him an almost supernatural ability to recognize mortality in others, to see past external confidence and success, to the shared vulnerability that defined human existence. Today's show was dedicated to living with purpose, a special episode highlighting people who had found ways to transform personal challenges into meaningful contributions to the world. The producers had positioned James as an inspiring artist who had turned his terminal diagnosis into a profound creative project that helped others understand death as a natural and beautiful part of human experience. But James Park carried a secret that would transform this celebration of purposeful living into something far more complex and controversial. He had gotten on the show by presenting his photography project as an uplifting exploration of life's preciousness, an artistic endeavor that helped families process grief and find beauty in their loved ones' final moments. It wasn't entirely untrue. Many families had found comfort in his photographs of their dying relatives, but the truth was that James's project had become an obsession that bordered on the macabre, a desperate attempt to understand his own approaching death by documenting the dying process in others with scientific precision and artistic intensity. James had been a successful commercial photographer for over a decade, specializing in corporate portraits and wedding photography, work that paid well, but left him feeling artistically unfulfilled. The terminal diagnosis had initially sent him into a depression that lasted several weeks, during which he couldn't imagine how to spend whatever time remained to him. But the moment of transformation had come during a visit to his grandfather, who was dying of complications from Alzheimer's disease in a hospice facility. As James sat beside his grandfather's bed, watching the old man's labored breathing and peaceful expression, he had witnessed something that changed everything. For just an instant, as his grandfather drew his final breath, James saw something in the old man's eyes, a clarity, a light, a presence that seemed to transcend the physical deterioration of his body. It lasted only seconds, but James was convinced he had witnessed the moment when his grandfather's soul became visible, preparing for whatever transition awaited beyond death. That experience had given James a new purpose for his remaining time. He would document this phenomenon, photographing dying people in their final moments, to capture what he believed was visual evidence of the soul's existence and its departure from the physical body. He began approaching hospice facilities, nursing homes, and families dealing with terminal illnesses, offering to photograph their loved ones during their final days at no cost, claiming it was his gift to help them remember the beauty and dignity of their family members' transition. Over 6 months, James had photographed 200 dying people, developing a technique that involved careful lighting, precise timing, and extraordinary patience to capture what he called soul photographs, images that he believed showed the exact moment when consciousness transcended physical existence. He had documented the deaths of cancer patients, elderly people dying peacefully in their sleep, accident victims in their final hours, and individuals choosing physician-assisted death with full awareness and preparation. The photographs were technically beautiful and emotionally powerful, showing faces that conveyed peace, transcendence, and what appeared to be awareness of something beyond physical reality. James had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone was approaching their final moments, positioning himself to capture the instant of transition with both artistic skill and scientific precision. But the project had also consumed James in ways that concerned the few people who knew the full extent of his work. He had become obsessed with death, spending every available moment in hospitals, hospices, and homes where people were dying, studying the dying process with intensity that sometimes disturbed family members who had initially welcomed his presence. James had begun to see his terminal diagnosis not as a tragedy, but as unique qualification for understanding and documenting the dying experience from the perspective of someone who knew he would soon undergo the same transition. The photographs had also revealed something troubling about James's psychological state. While his stated mission was to show the beauty and dignity of death, many of the images conveyed his own fear and fascination with mortality in ways that seemed to prioritize his artistic vision over the emotional needs of grieving families. Some family members had requested that he not share their loved ones' death photographs publicly, concerned that James's project was more about his own mortality fears than about honoring their relatives' memory. That's what had brought him to Oprah's show today. James felt compelled to share his work with a broader audience, to demonstrate what he believed was visual evidence of the soul's existence and the beauty of death's transition. He hoped that his photographs would help other people, especially those facing terminal illnesses like his own, understand death as something beautiful rather than terrifying, as a transition rather than an ending. The show's opening segments had featured inspiring stories of people who had transformed challenges into purpose. A woman who had started a nonprofit after losing her child to a rare disease. A man who had become a disability rights advocate after a paralyzing accident, and a teenager who had turned her experience with depression into a mental health awareness campaign. Each story was uplifting, each guest embodying the human capacity to find meaning in suffering and purpose in adversity. But when Oprah introduced James, something in her expression suggested she sensed this conversation might be different. "Ladies and gentlemen," Oprah announced, "I want you to meet James Park, James is a photographer who has spent the past 6 months working on what he calls his most important project, documenting the final moments of life with dignity and beauty. James is also courageously facing his own terminal diagnosis, and he's here today to share how his experience with mortality has shaped his artistic vision and his understanding of what it means to live with purpose. James stood carefully, his movement revealing the physical toll of his brain tumor treatment, but also the determined grace of someone who had made peace with his limitations. As he walked to the interview area, he carried his camera bag with him, not as a prop, but as an essential part of who he had become. The 300 audience members watching him represented, to James, 300 people who would eventually face the same transition he was documenting and would soon experience himself. As they settled into their chairs, Oprah noticed the intensity in James's eyes, the way he seemed to be studying, not just her face, but something deeper, as if he were constantly evaluating the mortality and life force of everyone he encountered. James, Oprah began gently, tell us about your photography project and how your own diagnosis has influenced your artistic vision. James had prepared to discuss the uplifting aspects of his work, the comfort it provided to families, the beauty he had discovered in life's final moments. But sitting across from Oprah Winfrey, acutely aware of his own approaching death and the limited time he had to complete his mission, the prepared responses felt inadequate to convey the true nature of his project and the urgency that drove it. Oprah, he began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent months thinking about mortality with unprecedented intensity. Most people are terrified of death because they think of it as an ending, as loss, as the moment when everything meaningful ceases to exist. But I've spent the past 6 months witnessing something extraordinary. Death as a moment of transcendence, as the instant when the human soul becomes visible. He opened his camera bag and carefully removed a professional camera, holding it with the reverence of someone handling a sacred object. With this camera, I photographed 200 people during their final moments, not their suffering, not their illness, but the exact instant when life transitions to whatever comes next. And in every photograph, I've captured something that I believe is visual evidence of the soul, a light in their eyes, a clarity of expression, a presence that transcends physical reality. The studio fell into unexpected quiet as people tried to process what James was describing. Are you saying you can see souls in your photographs? Oprah asked gently. James's eyes lit up with the passion of someone who had discovered something he believed was profound and revolutionary. I'm saying that in the moment of death, something becomes visible that isn't present during normal life, he said, his voice growing stronger. Every person I've photographed has shown the same phenomenon. Their eyes become clearer, their expression more peaceful, and there's a light, an energy that seems to come from within them that my camera can capture. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small portfolio of photographs, handling them with extraordinary care. These aren't morbid images of suffering or loss. These are portraits of transcendence, of the moment when the physical body releases the consciousness that has inhabited it. I believe I'm documenting the exact instant when the soul becomes visible as it prepares to move beyond material existence. Oprah was visibly moved but also concerned by the intensity of James's conviction. James, how did you get permission to photograph people during such intimate moments? How did families respond to your request? James's expression grew more complex as he addressed the ethical dimensions of his work. Initially, I approached families who were dealing with terminal diagnoses, offering to create beautiful memorial photographs of their loved ones during their final days, he explained. I presented it as a gift, a way to help them remember the dignity and peace of their family member's transition. He paused, his voice becoming more introspective. Most families were grateful for the opportunity. They wanted professional photographs that showed their loved ones' final moments as beautiful, rather than tragic. But as my project evolved, I realized I was documenting something much more significant than memorial portraits. I was capturing visual evidence of what happens to consciousness at the moment of death. His voice grew more passionate. The more photographs I took, the more convinced I became that I was documenting the exact process of the soul's departure from the physical body. Each image showed the same phenomenon, a moment of clarity and light that appeared just before the final breath, as if something essential was becoming visible as it prepared to leave. The audience was completely silent now, unsure whether they were witnessing profound artistic insight or the psychological effects of a terminal diagnosis on someone's perception of reality. James, Oprah said softly, how has working on this project affected your own relationship with your terminal diagnosis? James's entire demeanor changed as he discussed his personal motivation for the work. It's given me peace, he said simply. For months after my diagnosis, I was terrified of death, of non-existence, of the moment when everything I am would simply stop. But witnessing 200 people transition from life to death has shown me that something continues beyond physical existence. He held up one of his photographs, though he kept it turned toward himself rather than showing it to the camera. Every person I've photographed has shown me that death isn't cessation. It's transformation. The light I capture in their eyes at the moment of transition convinces me that consciousness, soul, whatever essential element makes us who we are, doesn't end with physical death. His voice became more emotional. I'm no longer afraid of dying because I've seen visual evidence that something survives the death of the body. My terminal diagnosis led me to document the dying process in others, and in doing so, I found proof that death is not the end, but a doorway to whatever comes next. That's when James did something unexpected. He turned one of his photographs around, showing it to Oprah and the camera, a black and white portrait of an elderly woman's face, her eyes closed, her expression peaceful, with what appeared to be an unusual clarity and luminosity around her features. This is Margaret Sullivan, 89 years old, who died from complications of pneumonia, he said, his voice reverent. This photograph was taken at the exact moment of her final breath. Look at her expression, the peace, the transcendence, the light that seems to emanate from within her. This is what I believe the soul looks like as it prepares to leave the body. The audience leaned forward, trying to see what James was describing in the photograph. Some people seemed moved by the dignity and beauty of the image, while others appeared uncomfortable with the intimacy of witnessing someone's death moment. James, Oprah said carefully, what do you hope people will understand about death from seeing your photographs? James looked directly at the camera, speaking to millions of viewers who would eventually face the same transition he was documenting. I want them to understand that death is not something to fear, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed the dying process from both sides. As an observer and as someone facing his own mortality, every photograph I've taken shows death as a moment of transcendence, of peace, of something beautiful rather than tragic. He gestured toward his camera bag. I want people to know that the moment of death is not the moment when everything ends, but the moment when something becomes visible that was always there but hidden by physical existence. The soul, consciousness, whatever essential element makes us who we are, it doesn't disappear at death. It becomes visible, radiant, free from the limitations of the physical body. His voice grew more urgent. For everyone facing terminal illness, for everyone afraid of death, for everyone who has lost someone they love, these photographs prove that something continues beyond physical existence. Death is not the enemy of life, but the completion of life, the moment when the soul reveals itself, before moving to whatever comes next. That's when something remarkable happened. From the audience, an elderly woman stood up, tears streaming down her face. Mr. Park, she called out, you photographed my husband Thomas 3 months ago. just before he died from lung cancer. I want to thank you for showing me the beauty in his final moment. The photograph you gave me has helped me grieve without despair, knowing that something of him continues beyond death." Other audience members began standing, some identifying themselves as people whose family members James had photographed, others sharing their own experiences with losing loved ones. "Your photograph of my mother showed me that death wasn't the end of who she was," another woman called out. "It helped me understand that her final moment was peaceful and beautiful, not the tragic ending I had imagined." James was crying now, overwhelmed by the response from families who had found comfort in his work. "This is why I do this project," he said to Oprah, "not just to document death, but to help people understand that death is a transition, not a termination. Every photograph I take shows families that their loved one's final moment was beautiful, peaceful, transcendent." But then another voice spoke up from the audience, a man whose expression suggested discomfort with James's project. "Mr. Park, you photographed my father without really explaining what you were doing," the man said. "We thought you were just taking memorial photographs, but you were actually documenting his death for your artistic project. Some of us in the family feel like you exploited his final moments for your own purposes." The studio fell silent as people recognized the ethical complexity of James's work. James's expression showed genuine pain as he confronted this criticism. "I understand that concern," he said slowly. "I've struggled with the ethics of my project, questioning whether I'm helping families process grief or pursuing my own artistic and spiritual needs. Some families have asked me not to share their loved ones' photographs publicly, and I've honored those requests." He paused, his voice becoming more introspective. "But I believe this work is important enough to justify the ethical complexity. If these photographs can help people understand death as something beautiful rather than terrifying, if they can provide comfort to families facing loss, if they can offer hope to people dealing with terminal diagnoses, then perhaps the discomfort some people feel is outweighed by the healing the work provides." Oprah was visibly struggling with the moral dimensions of James's project. "James, what gives you the right to photograph people during their most vulnerable and private moments?" James's answer revealed the depth of his conviction about his mission. "The same thing that gives doctors the right to study disease, that gives researchers the right to investigate consciousness, that gives artists the right to explore human experience," he said. "The belief that understanding death, documenting the dying process, and sharing visual evidence of what happens at the moment of transition serves a greater purpose than individual privacy concerns." His voice grew more passionate. "I'm dying, Oprah. In 12 months, maybe 18 if I'm fortunate, I'll be dead from the same brain tumor that's affecting my vision, my coordination, my cognitive abilities. This project isn't just about helping others understand death. It's about preparing myself for my own transition, by documenting what happens to consciousness when physical life ends." He looked directly at Oprah. "Would you let me photograph you? Not now, not for decades, hopefully, but when your time comes, would you trust me to capture the moment when your soul becomes visible as it prepares to leave your body?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone in the studio to confront their own mortality and their comfort level with James's unique mission. Oprah was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to respond to such an unprecedented request. "James," she said finally, "I'm honored that you would trust me with such an intimate moment, but I think your question reveals something important about your project. You're asking me to participate in your vision of death rather than my own. You're asking me to see my final moments through your artistic lens rather than experiencing them according to my own beliefs and needs." She leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "I think your photographs are beautiful, and I believe your intention to help people find peace with mortality is genuine. But I wonder if your project is more about your own fear of death than about serving the families you photograph." Are you documenting their transitions, or are you using their deaths to rehearse for your own? James sat in stunned silence, confronted with a perspective on his work that he had been avoiding. Maybe, he said quietly, it's both. Maybe I started this project to help others, but it's become my way of preparing for my own death by studying the dying process in others. His voice grew smaller, more vulnerable. Maybe I'm not photographing their souls. Maybe I'm looking for my own soul in their final moments, trying to understand what will happen to me when my brain tumor finally claims my consciousness. The honesty of his admission transformed the conversation, moving it from artistic celebration to genuine exploration of how terminal illness affects perception, purpose, and the desperate human need to find meaning in mortality. As the show concluded, James Park found himself embraced by Oprah, while still holding his camera, understanding for the first time that his project might be as much about his own fears as about helping others find peace with death. The man who had spent months documenting the final moments of 2,000 people had discovered that his artistic mission was also a psychological coping mechanism for his own approaching mortality. In the months that followed, James continued his photography project, but with greater awareness of the ethical implications and personal motivations behind his work. He began working more closely with hospice professionals and grief counselors to ensure that his photography served the needs of families rather than his own artistic vision. James also began preparing for his own death with the same intensity he had brought to documenting others' transitions. He arranged for a photographer to document his own final moments, hoping to provide one final image for his collection of soul photographs. The interview became a touchstone for discussions about art, ethics, and the ways people cope with terminal illness. It reminded viewers that mortality creates urgency that can lead to both profound insight and problematic decision-making, that artistic vision can both heal and exploit, and that the approach of death clarifies what matters most, while sometimes distorting perspective on what serves others versus what serves self. James learned that photographing souls was perhaps less important than nurturing them, that documenting death was meaningful only if it helped people live more fully, and that his greatest artistic achievement might not be capturing the moment of transition, but finding peace with his own approaching journey into whatever comes after this life. The soul photographer's gift was not his ability to capture death on film, but his capacity to help others, and ultimately himself, see mortality as a transition rather than an ending, as a doorway rather than a wall, as something to be faced with curiosity and courage rather than terror and despair.